If Jesus is the answer, why do I have so many questions? And maybe you have people asking stuff to you all the time. Hey, you know Jesus? I got a lot of questions about that. But I think the biggest question that many people have, particularly those who are new to the faith or not really delve deep into God's word, is why am I hurting? Why am I hurting? Jesus is the divine healer, so why am I hurting? If I'm following Jesus, I should have a perfect life. So why am I hurting? You know, when Jesus rose from the grave for 40 days, he walked around and showed himself to about 500 people total. And that very last day, day 40, he appeared to 120. And I can imagine all those instances that people were maybe asking the question, why is he appearing to me? Why now? I think those questions, why us, why now? I think those questions were filtering in through them, but he made it clear, particularly at that last 20, that the last 120, before he was going, he made it clear that there's something next for them. That he had something next for them. And so when we think about this question, why am I hurting? And if Jesus is the answer, why do I have all these questions? And if I'm following Jesus, why isn't my life perfect? Here's the issue. The issue isn't his faithfulness, it's possibly our follow-through. It's possibly our follow-through. You see, the early church, particularly, those 120, even those 500, the early church, they never had this question: why am I hurting? That was foreign to them at all. They were not going to ask that question, why am I hurting? Because they had something figured out. Something that Paul addresses in Romans 8:18. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed to us. I consider our present sufferings. See, Paul figured out, and I think the early church figured out too, quickly, that what you run to in pain runs your life. That what you run to in pain runs your life. You think about it this way. Some of us have had physical pain before, and what do we turn to? We run to some painkillers. But you know what happens to many people when they run to painkillers? They end up running your life. And maybe in times of discomfort or frustration, whatever, we run to people. We run to another person. And we know that also can run our life as well. Present suffering. The present suffering. Paul made sure and let us know and let his readers know that if it's the present, if you're in the present, if you're living in the present, there is going to be suffering. And he figured out that, hey, it's not worth comparing to the glory that will be revealed in us, because Paul had figured out that when Jesus came, suffered, crucified, was resurrected, that Jesus was bringing something to our lives that you can't compare anything else to. That glory is incomparable to nothing else. But so many of us think, hey, wait a second, if I'm following Jesus, then life should be a bed of roses. You do know this. Every rose has its thorn. You do know that. You do know that. This week I was talking to a couple of guys. They were telling me about a story that they were in a car with their dad and another gentleman. They were all Gideons, and these were young men, young boys in a car and at a cassette player. And this one Gideon leader was riding with them to the church, wherever they were going to, and the Poison tape was in the cassette player. And as soon as they turned the car on, a song started playing from Poison. The guy that was not their father in the car with them hit the eject and threw the Poison tape outside the car. And I said, y'all played the wrong song. That was the problem. You played the wrong song for Poison. But I think sometimes when we look at this idea that life should be a bed of roses if we're following Jesus, it may have come from misinformed interpretations of God's word. Because I believe that there are some passages that we look at, and maybe you've heard people tweak on this a little bit, and maybe you heard somebody maybe give you an interpretation that is not entirely accurate and gives you a hint that, hey, maybe life is a bed of roses if I follow Jesus, that I will have this prosperous life if I follow Jesus. And here's a few of them. John 10:10. The thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. I, Jesus says this, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. And that sounds great. It's because we talk about a full life. And for many of us, maybe we've heard that full life means a life of ease, a life of prosperity, where everything is coming our way. Everything is just going to be simple in our life. That's what a full life is, but Jesus doesn't say that's what a full life is. Jesus says a full life is a life with purpose and meaning. And I dare say this, that does not mean an absence of pain. Does not mean an absence of discomfort. Because you see, there is a danger in our lives of not having pain and discomfort and hurt. And I'll give you a story, analogy. There was a cocoon. We just had butterflies released at the botanical gardens. I'm sure they're all beautiful. I haven't made it out there yet. But there was a little boy who saw this cocoon, and the butterfly was struggling to get out of the cocoon. And he saw that, and he felt so sorry for this little creature. He could tell it was uncomfortable. He could tell it was in pain and was struggling. So what did he do? He reached and started peeling away the cocoon, so the little creature could easily emerge. But you know what happened? That creature fell to the ground because there was too much weight in its wings. Because it's in the struggle of coming out of that cocoon that flushes all the liquid out, all that fluid out of those wings so that they would be able to perform what they were meant to do. But it was only through the struggle and the pain that the butterfly can be that beautiful creature that we get to enjoy and get to marvel at. So a life devoid of pain and discomfort is not what Jesus is talking about. Because it actually made me it be in that pain and discomfort that God does his greatest thing in your life. You don't like to hear that. But Paul said these present sufferings, we're going to have them. Another passage that maybe you've heard people use before that leads you to believe that life is a bed of roses in Jeremiah. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. And we go, yes, that's my verse. That's my life verse. That's exactly what God's going to do in my life. He's going to prosper me and give all this wonderful stuff to me. But you know the context of that? This is spoken to people in exile, people in captivity. There was no immediate hope for comfort or relief. It was not coming immediately. In fact, if I remember my story correctly, the people that it was sent to, the people that it was spoken to, I don't think any of them got to enjoy it, the hope and future. It was their kids' kids. It's their grandkids and great-grandkids that got to see and experience a hope and have a better future than the one they had in captivity. Another passage, Philippians 4:13. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. Hey, I can do anything I want. My life can be successful. All I got to do is keep following Jesus. My life comes easy to me because I'm following Jesus. But that's not what Paul is talking about. Paul is talking about in this passage overcoming problems in our life, not avoiding them. And he was actually saying, I can be content in all the things that are going on in my life as he's in prison. I can be content in all these things because of Jesus, because I'm following Jesus. In Romans 8:28, maybe you've heard people skew this a little bit. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. And we sort of confuse that. And we look at the good and we say, oh, good, God's going to give me good things. God's going to give me all good things. Yeah, sort of. Sort of. Basically, what the context of this passage is, God's going to redeem all things. Whatever's going on, whatever the hard times, the present sufferings that you're going through, God's going to redeem those. So we look at Romans 8 a little later on in that chapter, Romans 8:35. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? So there's an emphasis on the love of Jesus. And the love of Jesus is personified and emphasized on the cross. That he loved us so much that he would die on the cross to save us from our sin. And we recognize that this sacrifice was love, complete love for all of us. You know, many religions, particularly when the Bible was written, many religions offered a blood sacrifice to reach God. God offered a blood sacrifice of his own son to reach us. The only one that did. The only one that did. And Paul says, yes, we emphasize the love of Christ, but trouble, hardship, persecution, famine, nakedness, danger, sword, that's all assumed. He's not saying if. He's basically telling you, okay, trouble, hardship, persecution, famine, nakedness, danger, sword, they're coming. They're coming. You're going to have that. These are the present sufferings that you're going to have in your life, but the love of Christ is there. Is there. Because what you run to in pain runs your life. You know that? What you run to in pain runs your life. And he quotes Psalm 44:24 in verse 36. As it is written, for our sake, you face death all day long. We are considered as sheep to be slaughtered. When we look over in Psalm 44, yet for your sake we face death all day long as we're considered sheep to be slaughtered. Then he says, awake, Lord, why do you sleep? Rouse yourself. Do not reject us forever. Why do you hide your face and forget our misery and oppression? The psalmist knew this, that who you run to in pain runs your life. He understood this. The psalmist, many psalmists, not just this one, would recognize present sufferings. They would recognize the trouble and the famine and the nakedness and the sword and all the sufferings that we would go through. Psalmists always recognize that that's a part of life. But what did they do? All of them, by and large, ran to God. Who you run to in pain runs your life. And every one of them ran to God, crying out, God, there's misery and oppression in my life, but what? They're going to God. They could have gone anywhere else. They could have gone to food. They could have gone to drink. They could have gone to addictions. They didn't. They turned to God. They cried out to God. The Psalms are so much like most of us. The psalmist writes and prays like so many of us because they're honest. God, where are you? I'm going through this misery and oppression. I am hurting. Where are you? Where are you? And I hope that that's where you are. And that in the hurting and the present sufferings in your life, you are turning to God. Because who you turn to in pain will run your life. Where you run to is going to run your life. So what's our response? What's our response? There's hurt. We're in present sufferings. What's our response? Well, some of us, and my friends from Celebrate Recovery know this. Hurt people hurt people. Hurt people hurt people. I think there's a good many of us that buy into that wonderful phrase, misery loves company. It's called Auburn fans. No, I'm just kidding. So, we have hope. We have hope. Misery loves company because so many of us, when we are hurting, when we're in pain, we want everybody else to know. We want to share our pain and our present sufferings with someone else. Sometimes we do it consciously. Sometimes we are dead on. We're going to make sure if I'm miserable, everybody around me is miserable. Sometimes it's subconsciously when we're hurting that it will come out. You know, maybe we get criticized and then we respond in judgment. Or maybe we get rejected and we just sort of distance ourselves from people because here's what's going on. And when we fail to process our hurts, we're going to project our hurts. When we fail to process all the hurt going on in our life, we're going to project those. In other words, who we run to in pain runs our life. And if we're running to somebody different in pain rather than God, we're going to project that hurt onto someone else. But here's the hope that I hope you catch today. God didn't wait for you to get it all together. He called you while he's putting you back together. God didn't wait to call you until you got it all together. He called you while he's putting you back together. In the New Testament, there's a guy named Saul in the first part of Acts who's killing Christians. He's hunting them down. Everybody that's following Jesus or following the way, as it was called then, so this guy named Saul was going after him. In the midst of that, in the midst of that, this dude Saul was walking down a road to Damascus. He was going to hunt down people there. And God called him. In the middle of him killing and arresting and torturing followers of Jesus, God called him to a specific task. And what did Saul do? Saul, in this moment in his life, knew who to run to. And when he ran to Jesus, then that ran his life. God directed him to a guy named Ananias. And actually prepared Ananias and said, Ananias, this guy Saul is coming to your house. He's been blinded, and I need you to help him out. Ananias said, no, don't do that. That dude, he's bad news. He's killed my friends. He's going to probably kill me. I don't want anything to do with him. So Ananias didn't have it all together. Even in the midst he was doing something God had called him to do, God continued to call him, and he used Ananias in that moment to bring Saul, who later became Paul, into the fold. You see, you don't wait till you have it all together before God calls you. God's going to call you while he's putting you back together. And the disciples were really the epitome of this, truthfully, because we're talking not that long before, well, a couple days before Jesus died. Actually, the day before Jesus died, the disciples were cowards. They ran away. When he was arrested, the disciples didn't want to have anything to do with all those 100 soldiers, and they took off. The day he died, only one, John, showed up as he was dying. 2 days after that, they were all huddled together in a locked room because they were cowards. And God called each and every one of them. Not because they had it all together, because he was going to put them back together as he called them. Here's what happened to the disciples. Shortly after Jesus rose into heaven, the apostles left the Sanhedrin rejoicing because they had been counted worthy of suffering disgrace for the name. They were rejoicing because they were suffering. They didn't have it all together, but they knew who to run to, and then they let God run their life. And they rejoiced. They were flogged, they were imprisoned, and they left rejoicing, all because of that. You see, here's the deal. God doesn't call the finished, he calls the forming. God doesn't call you when you're finished. God's going to call you and he's going to form you. And I know what many of you say, I'm not ready. I'm not ready. But God, every one of you are called. I don't know if you realize this or not, but every one of you is called. Now, I don't know exactly what you're called specifically in your life, but God has a calling on everyone's life. God's called you to follow him first and foremost, to worship and love him. And then after that, there's a specific call. There's a specific call, and I know you're probably not thinking that I'm ready to do anything, but here's what we're all called to do. We're all called to be like Jesus. If Nike was rebranding, be like Jesus. Okay? Be like Jesus. That means you love like Jesus. That means you walk like Jesus. You talk like Jesus. You treat people like Jesus treated them. And our goal should be, as followers of Jesus Christ, is to look as close as we can to being like Jesus. Now, there's a fancy name for that called sanctification, where we will be expected to be made perfect in this life. Perfect means we act like Jesus. But what we're striving to do is to be more and more like Jesus every day. And though we may never totally 100% arrive, that is our goal. And our goal is to look more and more like Jesus every day. Because God doesn't call you when you're made perfect. He's called you to form you into being like Jesus. That's what he's called you to do. In 1984, it was the spring of 1984, I was studying for a chemistry class at college, and I felt like God said, I'm going to call you to the pastoral ministry. And that was that specific, to be a pastor. The spring of 84, 26 months later was the first time I started working at a church. But I say, God had called me. God had called me. And 26 months later is when I went to my first church. Yes, that's correct. Because God was still forming me. And even that 2.5 months at that church, that summer, and then the summer the next year, 2.5 months, God was still forming me. Then I went to grad school. For 4 months, I just basically went to school. Then another church. I got to be on staff at another church. God was still forming me. God was still forming me. Still part-time. My first full-time gig really wasn't until 1992. So from 84 to 92 was that time gap before I had a full-time gig as the pastor, as the only pastor, well, only paid person at this church that I went to in 92. But it's like God called me. Shouldn't I have just boom, went no? God was forming me during that time. One of the things that I love to witness is when we ask people in our church community, and I say we being members of our staff, pastors and other ministry leaders, we approach somebody and say, hey, I really believe that you'd be good leading a group of kids or a group of students or a small group of adults. And many times we get pushback. And they go, no, I'm not ready. In other words, they're saying, I don't have it all together. I don't have it all together. But eventually, with some arm twisting and bribery, whatever we got to do, many will say, I'll give it a shot. And invariably, so many times, they come back to us after a certain amount of time and say, you know what? Thank you. Thank you for encouraging me to do this. And almost all of them say, I got more out of it than I believe they did. I think God worked in me more than worked in with my kids or my students or my small group. It happened, I even had this really quick conversation Wednesday with a gentleman that's been teaching for years in this church and another church. And he said the same thing again. Because he is a wonderful teacher. And he said the same thing. I said, I'm still getting more out of it than I believe my class is. Why? Because I understand that God doesn't call the finished, He calls the forming. He calls the forming. Which leads me to remind you of this. That as He's forming us, in all of our hurting, in all of our present sufferings, that hurt people can help people. Hurt people can help people. And as much as we don't want to consider this, pain can be a platform. Pain can be a platform. It was for Paul. Paul had a thorn in the flesh. 3 times he asked God to take it out. God said, nope. So Paul turned that pain into a platform where he pointed other people to God because he was basically reminding them many times who we run to in pain will run our lives. What you run to in pain will run your life. And pain reveals that. Pain reveals what we're going to run to. Because so many of us will try the quick fixes. When we have pain, we're going to try the quick fixes. And if we try those quick fixes, many times that leads to addictions in our lives. All of us hurt. It could be literal physical pain. It could be relationships, grief, anxiety, regret, disappointment, wounds from the past. But here's the deal. Hurt people don't have to stay on the sidelines. Hurt people do not have to stay on the sidelines. We can help people. Why? Because we are being healed. Because we know where to run to. And we know where not to run to. So if you have a hurt or habit or hang up, you can sit across from the table at somebody at Celebrate Recovery and remind them that they're not alone. If you experience grief or loss, you can come beside somebody and just be with them with no words. Just be with them. If your relationship has survived some rockiness, you can encourage the younger generation that it will be okay. If you struggle with anxiety or depression, you can come along someone and say, hey, you know what? This will not last forever. And if you've come out of a life that you've had some regrets, you can remind another person, you know what? That regret is not going to have the last word in your life. So don't ask the question, am I healed enough to help? Ask the question, where God has met me, who needs that today? Where God has met me, who needs that today? Pain is not just something to survive. It's something God can use. Your pain can be a platform. Your struggle can be someone else's starting point. Your story can be someone else's hope. So just take a simple step. Ask God, who is one person I can help? Who is one person I can help because of what I've been through? And just go do it. Send a text, make a visit, show up, share your story, make a phone call, pray with them. What you run to in pain runs your life. Why us? Why now? Because when hurting people run to God, they let God run their lives. And hurting people stop hurting people and start helping people. You know, the church, every church, but particularly our church, because that's where we are today, this should be the best place for that to happen. That should be the best place. It shouldn't be at the bar down the street. Shouldn't be at a ball field. This is the best place it should be, is right here. Hurting people help people. You don't have to have it all together. But know God's working in you to form you and put you back together. Do you know where to run to? When you're in pain, and you will be. If you're not, you will be. Do you know where to run to? That will run your life.